Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello and welcome to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions in life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Aditi Kutty. Let's get on with the show. Now, I'm here today with Dr. Ashley Randall. She's a PhD in Family Studies and Human Development and Associate Professor in Counseling and Counseling Psychology. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for the invitation. It's quite an honor.
Do you want to tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am presently an associate professor and honors faculty in counseling and counseling psychology at Arizona State University in the US, where it is a frigid, probably 60 degrees Fahrenheit here, if you sense my sarcasm. I have had the wonderful fortune and opportunity to collaborate with students and colleagues around the world, and so really passionate about international educational exchange, as well as how couples cope with stress in the context of their relationship. And so delighted to be here to be able to share some of the tips and tricks, if you will, and some of the findings from our research over the years.
You're in the perfect place for that because we are a global podcast, and this episode in particular is all about relationship stress. So you're the perfect person to talk to.
Excellent. I'm so glad I made it to the right place.
I did have to look up what 60 degrees Fahrenheit is in Celsius, because that's what we use here. And 15 and a half degrees is frigid, I would say. I think anything under 20 can be quite cold.
Well, excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know that my friends and colleagues from around the other parts of the U.S. would agree, but I appreciate the affirmation in that regard.
It would probably be a balmy day in Chicago, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Now, we are going to chat again about relationship stress, like I said earlier. But before we kind of get into that, we have a segment called Have You Met Ashley Randall, where we have to get to know you a little bit. I'm going to throw some really quick questions at you, and you don't have to think too hard on them. You just have to answer them. Sounds good? Ready?
Yes,
awesome.
sounds great.
What's your favorite book?
So my favorite book that I have read a couple of years ago was Thrive by Arianna Huffington. And it is an amazing, amazing read just in terms of how it is that we as individuals can redefine success and the ways in which societies, more globally can really think about taking care of the human capital.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. A really great suggestion. What about your favorite movie?
So my favorite movie, this is challenging because I love documentaries. As I was chatting with you earlier before we started the recording, I know that reality television is not a movie, so I will ignore that sidebar for a second. And I will say, I really just love Finding Nemo. Like that is probably one of my favorite little cartoon. Although Luca, sorry, I'm not answering your question. Luca was also very good. Yes, because we have a cat, Luca, so that's probably why I enjoyed it so much.
Yeah. I haven't actually seen Luca yet, so that's my dirty little secret. But Finding Nemo, a classic, absolutely amazing. This is not one of the questions I was going to ask you, but what are your favorite reality shows?
Oh, well, see, we would be here all afternoon if I were to answer that. However, I would say combine relationships, combine the global nature of the world at 90 Day Fiancé is a must.
Yep. That's a classic. I've not, again, like we said earlier, I don't watch reality TV shows, but I have seen a lot of clips from 90 Day Fiancé. I can definitely see the appeal of it.
Absolutely. Yes.
What about a podcast that you're listening to at the moment and you're really into?
Yeah, so I would say some of the go-to podcasts, speaking of psychology, which is published by the American Psychological Association, is always really great in terms of up-to-date research. And then I would say for long road trips, just to keep myself awake, I'm usually really into the Dateline podcasts of the murder mystery stories.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. True crime is great for a road trip.
Yes.
Definitely doesn't make you concerned about anything that could happen to you at night at all. What about a famous role model that you look up to?
This is a question that I think there's a so many ways in which I could probably answer this, but let me just answer with one of the people whom I've followed their life story more recently in the past couple of years, and I've just really admired their resilience and all of their accomplishments, and that would be Serena Williams. I think the way in which that she has really developed into who she is, and not only who she is as an athlete, but who she is as a human being and as a member of her family is just remarkable. And her story is just amazing. So yeah, really appreciate following her journey.
You're actually not the first person on this podcast who's mentioned Serena Williams as their role model. So that's pretty cool. But she is an incredible woman and
Totally.
a huge role model for so many. I know myself as someone who's really into tennis, Serena Williams is one of my favorites as well. So yeah. What about the last course you've completed?
Now, the last course that I've completed, so apart from my doctorate, was probably, oh gosh, this is a very good question. The last course that I completed actually was completed a series of workshops for academics for Black survival and wellness. And this came out around the COVID-19 and the racism syndemic that happened in the US and likely across the globe. And so really appreciated the opportunity and all of the work that went into recognizing our historical systems of oppression and how it is that we can view ourselves as agents of change in the ever-moving society. So that was probably the last course that I completed.
That's a really important one in light of like what we've been learning over the last 2 years. But it's definitely been a global movement. I mean, it's been huge here in Australia as well, and it's definitely like an ongoing one for sure.
Yes.
But
And I was just going to say, you mentioned the ongoing, which I could not agree with you more, right?
yeah.
So this is something that, although we may finish a class, it's a lifelong journey just in terms of being multiculturally confident. So I appreciated the nudge in the positive direction.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of this segment. Ashley Randall, you are known. So thank you so much for letting us get to know you a little bit. Now we might move on to the main part of our episode, which is about relationship stress, particularly all of the factors that go into relationship stress and what affects it. But before we kind of focus in on that, I wanted to kind of zoom out a little bit. What is a relationship? How do you define or describe a relationship?
Yeah, so excellent question. So I would say, we can, and oftentimes when people ask, like, what's a relationship or how do we define relationships? I would say that for many of us, we either implicitly connect with our close friends, our romantic partner, or family members. And I would say underlying all of these, and this is certainly not necessarily just specific to work that we've done, but the relationship science field as a whole, is that we can consider maybe 6 core components of what defines a relationship. And if you think about anyone in your life, we have knowledge about this person, right? So we have understandings about their likes, their dislikes, maybe their goals that they have. So that would be one element in terms of knowledge. Additionally, we care for this individual. Right? I mean, certainly we care about their needs, we care about their well-being, and so we often want to reach out and understand how they're doing, which over time fosters trust. And we have commitment in terms of that relationship. And so there's 2 additional components that I would say that are also really important to think about. And that is the idea of mutuality, or that we both have, mutual benefits and that we kind of fit together like a puzzle. There's this me versus we type thing. And so we really think about things as this we or joint perspective. And the last is interdependence. And what that means is that when we think about our close relationships, is that our emotions and our behaviors are often coordinated with one another. So unfortunately, when we hear some couples say, you make me feel this way, there is some validity to that, although it's probably not a good way to start a discussion.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of phrasing I've learned has been so important in the way you approach your partner, and honestly, in general, any kind of relationship that you have with anyone. It's super
Absolutely.
important. In your opinion, what does a relationship hold the same kind of meaning and importance that it did perhaps decades ago, specifically romantic relationships?
Yeah, so this is another excellent question. And I'm going to actually default to research that has been done by Eli Finkel. And actually, he has recently published a book called The All or Nothing Marriage. And in his volume, and as a social psychologist at Northwestern in the US, he really has taken a wonderful perspective of how it is that we can think historically about how our relationships have changed. So we started, and this is from a Western perspective, really thinking about relationships as the idea, as he coins it, as workmates, right? So we've started relationships wherein these individuals can really help us to thrive in terms of our working environment. And so if you think, predominantly in farming, we have to, ensure that everything is done on the farm. And then we look towards the industrialization around the 1850s, and that's when things started to change. And so we went from kind of this workmates to more of a soulmate. So we really care about that our relationships are built on love and trust in some of those core areas that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. And then in his book, he really kind of then fast forwards to present day. And so if we go from a historical perspective to understanding our relationships as workmates, to now we want our relationships to not only be our soulmates, but our best friends and our best friends. And so it's really thinking about how it is that we can break down historical gender stereotypes to have a more egalitarian relationship, wherein partners can really foster each other's sense of self and authenticity.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, especially the breaking down of gender stereotypes to actually make our, I guess, idealized version of romantic relationship possible. Because a lot of what holds us back is those gender roles and our expectations of, how to perform based on how we were born at birth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say even more to that, if I may, that, I would also say a very important part, which, we don't have to necessarily look too far back into history, but where it is about whom it is that we are including in terms of who can form a relationship. And so certainly we have seen, many countries and many cultures that have made significant strides to being more inclusive in terms of who can hold a relationship, especially as it comes with the legal rights. And then many others that are still kind of facing, those disparities.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. How do you define relationship stress?
Yeah, so this is another excellent question. So relationship stress. So let me kind of break this down, if you will, in terms of how can we think about stress in the context. And this is work that I've done with my colleague, Guy Bodeman at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, and really thinking about when we ask people, are you stressed or what are you stressed about? Oftentimes, depending on cultural context, from a Western perspective, people will often give tasks, right? Or lists of things that are stressing them out. And one could be, my partner is stressing me out. Yet if we really try to understand and think about this, it's really important to think about the origin of where that stress comes from. And so relationship stress, if you were taking it just at face validity in terms of how we're defining relationship stress, that would actually be considered stress that originates inside the relationship. That would be maybe difficult habits of your partner. So hypothetically, right, like, whatever annoying partner habits that you can think about, we can replace those there. Yet these are the things that really annoy me or frustrate me about my partner. Or maybe you have differing relationship goals. Someone wants to get married, move in together, the other does not, etc. So the relationship stress really originates outside the relationship. Yet, and I know we're going to get there, is that there are certainly stressors that we need to be mindful of that happen outside of a relationship that can actually exacerbate the stress that we're feeling within our relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are definitely going to talk a lot about, how stress can happen both within and outside of relationship and jumble up into one big tangled mess, if that's the best way to describe it. How does relationship stress affect relationships?
Yes, I'll give you the quick answer, negatively. However, let me explain that a little bit. So if we think about it, one of the most interesting things I think is that people are not necessarily as aware of how much stress outside of our relationship can really impact our relationship and our perception of our partner. So for individuals who are, working outside the home, or students that are going to school or having additional, jobs or whatnot, these are all things that unfortunately we have stress on a daily basis. Maybe being, confronting traffic, for example. However, what will happen is that over time, these little stressors or daily hassles, like we like to consider them, can certainly build up. And what happens is that we then start to come home and we may be really aggravated. We may be really frustrated or stressed out. Well, when we are already kind of experiencing those negative emotions, what happens? Well, our partner's annoying habits or these differing goals can really seem much more exacerbated because of this idea of stress spillover. So the external stressors outside of our relationship have really spilled over into our relationship, causing stress within our relationship. And then even more so is our stress can cross over to our partner. So maybe you come home and you've had a really bad day. Your partner may have just gotten a promotion, or they've gotten a new job, or, they heard from a friend that they haven't heard from in a while. And they're really excited to tell you this news. Yet as they can potentially read the stress, from you, that then dampens their positive affect as well. And so it can kind of cause this cascade of negative emotions if couples are not necessarily able to identify it and cope with it in the moment.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, essentially overall, just very negatively, and we need to learn how to manage it in order to make sure to at least reduce the amount of stress we're dealing with. But we'll talk a bit more about that later. What we talked a little bit about, daily stress and internal stress that might be affecting couples, but what does it actually look like? How does it manifest?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. Mm-hmm. So there are certainly a variety of, theoretical models in terms of how stress can impact relationships. And please know that my perspective is coming from one that is trained really systemically in terms of thinking about partners as that interdependent unit, right? So we can't necessarily separate one partner's experience from the other. So how it is that one partner's experiences of stress, as I mentioned, not only spills over into the relationship, or one partner's experiences of stress, the external stressors spill over into the relationship. Okay, so that's causing these like internal stressors. In addition, that stress is crossing over to the partner. So now we have these elements of negative interactions. Over time, what will happen is that we often see decreases in terms of communication, right? Or we see an increase of potentially not effective communication. And so it's really important to think about that even though we think we are not communicating, maybe we're not necessarily expressing how stressed we are, we may be doing so non-verbally, right? So coming in, sighing, eye rolling, I don't want to talk about this, I need some time. These are all ways in which we are communicating to our partner about how it is that we are feeling. If, however, partners are not able to then utilize this moment to actually, create and foster this sense of we-ness and mutuality that we can handle this together, then over time, it's when we see kind of the exacerbation of, problematic personality traits, things that are annoying each other about the partner, and then people actually start having mutual alienation, right? I don't want to talk to you. You're stressed again. Well, I'm not going to talk to you because you're not able to help me. And then unfortunately, over time, we see relationship dissolution.
Mm-hmm. And what you said earlier about how even though we're not communicating verbally, we're still communicating, we're still telling our partner things just through our actions. That's such an important thing that we often forget about all the time. What exactly this? I've got a really long question sitting in front of me and I'm trying to simplify it. What exactly can people get stressed about? Is it daily stresses? We talked about that already, but are there perhaps issues where we compare ourselves to other relationships that might seem happier externally, or, just general commitment or fear of intimacy? How are those involved in relationship stress?
Yeah, so these are really like excellent questions. And I would say that if we look across a relationship lifespan, And I will say this from kind of that relationship initiation phase of we're trying to, maybe we've just met someone, we're trying to gauge whether or not they're interested in us. Then we're kind of moving into that relationship development phase of trying to understand, okay, what are we doing? Are we dating? I'm sure that there's a million and one terms that I'm not familiar with now that I'm in a married relationship. So it's like thinking about then how do we move from this relationship development to really these relationship maintenance phases. And a lot of our work and the work that I do with my colleagues is focusing on these relationship maintenance behaviors. Yet to your point, certainly, right? Like there are certain stressors that will come up both individually as well as relationally at all different stages of the relationship. So a lot of colleagues will look at differing individual differences. So how people approach relationships, the lenses to which they approach relationships, different compatibilities in terms of interests. And then it is that we're looking across the lifespan, is that not only within the individual or with even in the couple, yet certainly we have to recognize the more societal stressors as well as macro level stressors, or we would consider them, that are going on in addition to life events, from potentially deciding to move in together to then, and that's really an element of commitment that you had mentioned in terms of a potential stressor. Then, taking the next phase in the relationship, whether it be, formalizing that relationship and getting married, or potentially having or adopting children, or taking care of parents or siblings, etc. There's like ample opportunity to have stress in relationships. Yet, I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, because there's also ample opportunity to then cope with those and create a stronger relationship with your partner.
Yeah, absolutely. In that case, we talked about how relationship stress isn't really just one person's relationship stress. It used to be, it's usually between the various people in the relationship. But how do we know that our relationship is suffering from relationship stress? That feels like an obvious question, but I also think it can sneak up on us.
No, absolutely. Of course it could. And I think that it's really, really important. And this is, again, I want to certainly credit those that have done a lot of work in this area. So certainly like thinking about John Gottman's work and thinking about the importance of, and certainly communication scholars, of the importance of talking and having actual conversations. And I think it's very different than having conversations that are like, hey, how was your day? Oh, it was good. Okay, great. Moving on. Yet really understanding at the core of what was so positive about that. You had a great day. Like what was great about it? Oh, what does that mean for you? And conversely, something negative or something stressful is going on. What does that mean for you as well? Because although we can think about it, we all may experience stress from work, let's say. And at the onset, it's, oh, you're having a stressful day. Yet we're not necessarily really understanding for that one individual what that may mean for them, because that could certainly mean different things. Yeah. And so I think please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Keep going.
No, I was just going to say, like being mindful of, certainly, hopefully our romantic partners and our partners will, have an understanding of who we are as individuals. And so oftentimes we can see changes in our partner's mood or affect or maybe interest level. And so I think these are all ways in which these are little, dots, if you will, on a radar of, oh, this is something that's different, in time to check in. And is everything okay?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, how are you able to tell these things if you're not keeping up healthy practices like communication with your partner or engaging in mindfulness? Like, is there a way to know? Is it perhaps inherent?
I don't know if it's inherent or it's just those, like, for many of us that study relationships and then those that love relationships, I think we could talk about relationships all the time. Good thing you're not having my partner on this podcast, because she would likely say something different in terms of how fun it is to always talk about relationships. Yet I do think it's just really important to care and nurture the relationships that you have with people. And certainly we have to recognize that not everyone has come from backgrounds or cultures wherein having these deep disclosures of let's sit down and, let's have a cup of coffee or a tea or a glass of wine and chat about our day. Yet it's trying to understand and meet your partner where they are. So it's really understanding how much disclosure is comfortable for that individual. And even more so, what are the questions that you can ask that can help facilitate that discussion? And I think also trusting yourself as well. If things seem not okay, then trust yourself to know that and to use that as a barometer, for your relationship.
Mm-hmm. What's the earliest point you can know? What's kind of an early sign, perhaps, that there's some kind of relationship stress ongoing at the moment? Is that even possible?
That is a very good question. I would say that there's not necessarily a point where there's not necessarily an element of stress. Yet I think, so let me try to answer your question, yet rephrase it a little bit differently, is that it's really important that one builds a really strong foundation of trust and commitment with one's partner. And so I think that it's not the time when, oh my gosh, we're having these stressful, things are stressful. We're having these disagreements all the time. This isn't working. Let's start working on our relationship. Well, what happens, right, is that if you think about it, all of us interact on a second by second basis. And so I'm not going to by any means do the math for you now, but this is like a good exercise for those of you that have calculators. Thinking about the average couple will seek treatment, whether it be, like a relationship, participating in a relationship education program or seeking therapy 7 years into their relationship. So now going back to that second by second, imagine how many seconds of interaction there are in 7 years of a relationship. And then at year 7 or even earlier, a couple comes and they're like, we want to undo this pattern that we've gotten ourselves into. It takes work, right? And all relationships take work. And so I think it's really important that if you start to do the work early, then it's not necessarily so daunting when the times get tough, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I've always said, all relationships take work. It's finding the person that you want to do the work with.
Mm-hmm. 7 years is a really, really long time. Why do you think it takes so long?
I think in some ways, that's one excellent question. And I think that in some ways, what happens is that people have, likely from the media and maybe from stories or, different perspectives in terms of how relationships, quote, should be or should look, or once you get into a relationship, you have to make it work no matter, the circumstances. And I think that certainly has detriments, when we're talking about negative relationship behaviors. Yet in some respects, and I think this is likely different across cultures, yet there's almost a sense of, we have committed to this relationship. We know who each other are, or yet we can change that person and we can change together. And so we know that there's there's certainly, some element of certainly we grow and develop, yet we aren't going to become different people overnight. And so I think that in that time, there's kind of this hope and long exaggeration of we can make it through this, or this isn't a big deal, or even more so, let me ignore some of these concerns. And it just happened once and it's likely not going to happen again. And unfortunately, we know that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So oftentimes couples will get into these cycles. And I think it's a time wherein not only is that relationship stress really high, but likely there's other stressors as well. And so it becomes kind of, I'm reached my max. And so what do I need to do?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier that, sometimes you have to find the right person to manage the relationship stress with. How do you know that it's the right person? And at what point do you kind of decide that the relationship stress you're trying to overcome might not be worthwhile?
So that the stress is not worthwhile, or that the relationship is not
worthwhile?
Oh gosh, that is such a loaded question that I'm afraid. Yeah, I think, I think it's really important to recognize that individuals complement, or not should, but individuals complement each other in relationships. And I think that if in the event partners come up to like a threshold wherein there's more negative interactions than there are positive interactions, and or there's the inability or the unavailability, if you will, of the partner to even engage in some of these conversations. It's not that the relationship is over, yet it's a really important time to really reflect, to say, how am I, like, what am I getting out of this relationship? And alternatively, like, what am I giving in this relationship? And there's certainly, Gottman's 5-to-1 ratio of 5 positives to 1 negative. And alternatively, some other theoretical models looking at the cost and benefit analysis in terms of we should certainly have more benefits and feelings of positivity than we should costs. And so I think when we start to look at that, or we start to even from an individual perspective, lose a sense of who we are as an individual and only identify with ourselves in that relationship, it's an important part to think about, how it is that this relationship is really, allowing us to self-actualize together.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know that was quite a loaded question, but I think you handled it pretty well. Because sometimes you do have to just ask yourself whether this relationship is something that is, something that you want to continue with, or whether it's perhaps both of you might be better off with other people. And I don't think, well, the media certainly doesn't teach us to ask ourselves that question enough.
Not at all. And I will say, right, I mean, like, certainly, the advent of technology and online dating, et cetera, it's challenging, right, to even say, okay, I'm going to put my all into this relationship, when alternatively, potentially, if you're online, I have like 15 other people potentially waiting. So why would I, give into this when there's other alternatives? And so certainly, I think it's really just having introspection in terms of kind of what are your non-negotiables and what are the things that are really important for you, and whether or not that person or people that you are searching for can really complement that.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a recommendation of a practice or a habit to manage relationship stress?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much for asking. And so I'm happy to kind of go into this, if you will, if you are ready.
I'm so ready.
Okay, excellent. So as we were talking about the importance of communication, one of the things is being very intentional with one's communication. Now, as I mentioned, so some of the research suggests that upwards of 93% of our communication is nonverbal. So when we have partners, like I mentioned, that maybe are sitting, reading, looking at their phone, reading a book, looking outside, not paying attention, rolling their eyes, crossing their arms, kind of this closed off body language, they're communicating something. So I often say, remember that one cannot not communicate. So first, it is very, very important that couples learn how to verbally communicate their stress to one another. And these are all elements that are part of work that I have done with my colleague Guy Bodeman and currently Casey Totenhagen, looking at relationship education programs and teaching couples this idea of dyadic coping. So we're coping together with the stress. So once you kind of get in a rhythm in terms of how it is that you want to communicate your stress to your partner, which could really seem, inauthentic if you're not used to verbally saying, I'm stressed, right? Now, it's really important that beyond that initial level, like I talked about, is that we really kind of dig deep down. And this is part of the funnel method, if you will, of some of these programs, is really thinking about what is the personal meaning for you. So let me give you a tangible example from a relationship education program that we're working on. So you and your partner are in an airport, okay? And there's a long line. You can't wait to get on your, first, hopefully, COVID-free vacation. And people, you're potentially late for your flight or late for boarding, and people jump in front of you. And not only do they jump in front of you, there's other people that start to jump in line. Certainly, this would be stressful for anyone, yet it's reflecting what about this situation is stressful. Okay. And it's not necessarily something that can be answered in an immediate thought, yet over time, because we usually give partners about 30 minutes to disclose this to their partner, what we see is that we move from a very superficial level of this person cut in front of me to more of like the thoughts behind, well, I'm really frustrated. I'm like, I can't even believe that they would cut me off. I'm not able to do this, to maybe some of the core emotions of, it really bothers me when I feel overlooked. And when I feel overlooked, I feel like I'm not important. Okay. So it's allowing one partner to really that open space to verbalize that, while maybe the non-stress partner, or rather the listening partner, is really there to then receive what's going on for the partner. Not interjecting with, well, have you tried this? Why are you upset? What does this matter? Like, let's get over it. But rather taking a more listening role. And then I think in that regard, what it allows is to really build that feeling of connection between partners, so that they can then start to have that trust over time. And so I think that just even, developing space for that in the day can be really important for partners, whatever time of day that works for them, certainly.
Yeah. So is it usually that there's one listening partner and one partner who is expressing themselves? Is that across the whole 30 minutes, or do they swap at some point?
Yeah, excellent question. So in the 30 minutes when we're teaching them these skills, we usually have the one partner who is describing their stress for the 20 minutes. And certainly it's not just a 20-minute, information dump, so to speak, but rather it's, talking and then having the listening partner reflect. Oh, I hear that you're saying this, right? Not necessarily asking questions that are ancillary to whatever the stress is, but, oh, I heard that someone cut you off. Like, I heard that you're frustrated about this. Like, tell me more about what happened. And then, the partners kind of talk in this rhythm, for about, 20 minutes. And then after, the next phase of this training is really allowing that listening partner to then reflect about how it is that they would offer support and affirmations to their partner. And so I heard that, someone cut you off at the airport, and if they were together, certainly, it would be a different reflection. Yet I know that this is really stressful for you because, you really care to be acknowledged. And when you're not acknowledged, you feel this way. And please know that I acknowledge you, and I acknowledge all of the things that you do in a positive manner. So it's providing more of kind of this emotion, what we consider emotion focused coping. So not only empathy, yet also building kind of this positive regard.
Absolutely.
And then after that, we provide space for the partner to say, that was really helpful for me. Like, I appreciate you, providing that empathy and empathizing and sharing emotionally with me. Yet it would be helpful for me in the future if maybe you could do X, Y, and Z. Because oftentimes what happens is when we're stressed, we assume incorrectly what we think the other person needs. And so It's really important to allow people to just talk, reflect, and then respond emotionally and have the other person say what they need.
Yeah, for sure. So for the person who is speaking, how do they get started? Is it based on a question prompt, or do they perhaps begin by asking themselves questions that they can then verbalize to their partner?
So this is an excellent question. So certainly in the more formalized relationship education program, there's a formal start and end point. However, I will say that like myself and others that I know that engage in these practices, they kind of make it not necessarily a ritual, but they at least allow time for it in their day. So maybe for some couples, like I mentioned, it's, hey, let's take 15 minutes in the morning or however long that we have in the morning to engage. Or maybe we have a break during the day that we can just chat about each other's day. Alternatively, at night or in the evening. Yet it's incredibly important that when partners are feeling, these negative emotions from a variety of contexts, like outside the relationship, that they then think about their partner as their greatest source of support to be able to then cope with their partner and really have the partner cope with them, so that they don't feel as though that it's just them kind of out in the world, but that they have a double set of armor, as I like to think about it.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What are 3 good things about this practice?
three good things about this practice. So one, it is empirically supported. So for those of you that are maybe out there like, oh, okay, I don't know about this. Let me tell you, it's empirically supported by many years of science. In addition, some of the research has actually shown that not only from cross-sectional studies, so studies that are taken at one moment in time, but certainly longitudinal, upwards of over a 2-year period, that has not only this practice in particular in engaging in this dyadic coping not only decreases symptoms of stress or distress within oneself, but certainly increases relationship quality and longevity over time.
What are kind of the challenges that people might come across when they're trying this?
I think it's really challenging when we as individuals or as societies and whatnot, is that we think that we are communicating effectively. And we think that what we are saying is being heard in the way that we intend it to say. And so I will say that portion of when the listening partner actually reflects to the partner of this is what I heard you say, that is really a really important time for partners to say, no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was this, to clarify some of those instances. And it's really important as one is describing their stressors to use I statements, because oftentimes we can easily get into blaming of you statements, and you made me feel this way and you did this, in comparison to, right, I feel upset when you don't take the time to listen to me because it makes me feel that I don't matter or whatnot. So I think that those are some of the
challenges. Yeah, I think that's important to point out, because as much as we need to communicate more, we're not necessarily perfect communicators. I don't think any human being is born a perfect communicator. So it's important
I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's important to make sure that we we communicate exactly what we mean and make sure that they understand exactly what we mean. How often do you recommend couples engage in this practice?
I would say as often as needed, truthfully. And I will say that, likely when people start to think about, let's sit down and let's practice these ideas, it may seem a little awkward, right? Like, oh, we haven't done this before. Yet over time, it becomes a natural conversation between partners. And so I think it's really important to even make that time to recognize, what are the biggest stressors that are going on for you at work? Who's your closest, friend right now, and why are they friends? And asking kind of really some of these deep and meaningful questions that really allow one's relationship to continue to flourish.
Absolutely. And when you say, when you find the need for it, is it generally when, you recognize that some stress has occurred or is affecting you? Or would it be perhaps even on days where you don't feel like there's something going on, but it might be helpful to engage in it anyway?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I would say, any and all times, right, that I think having these conversations and creating this open dialogue, with partners, and I recognize that, many are in, long distance relationships or potentially in different time zones. And so it's important to be mindful of that. However, having deep and meaningful conversations with one's partner as often as possible really allows this to foster the relationship. So that way, when the stress does happen, it's not like, okay, wait, let's stop, let's sit, let's practice our talking while we're really stressed out. Yet it becomes a more routine engagement with one's partner.
Right. How do you think this practice will impact your relationship or your perception of life?
I think it's, one of the greatest gifts that we have as human beings is not only the ability to have this sense of belonging with wanting to connect with others. Yet I think for many of us that have the ability to do so is that the engaging in really empathy and empathic learning and impact, and trying to be as empathetic as we can to each other's situations, stressors, as well as life experiences. And I think that the more that we can listen and reflect versus verbalizing and thinking about what it is that we need, I think it really just provides an open opportunity for people to have and create a deeper connection.
Absolutely. And based on your experience, first, would you recommend this practice to absolutely everyone? Or are there
Yes.
perhaps groups of people that might not respond as well to it?
No. So one of the things to keep in mind is that our research is being done, like currently we are conducting our study with sexual minority and gender diverse couples. And so a lot of the other research has often included these individuals, yet with smaller samples, and so individuals who identify as different gender or heterosexual. So that's who the research is included in that regard. But yes, everyone should be talking about relationships all the time. And everyone should care about relationships. No, in all honesty, I do think it's really important as we look at kind of what's a potential unifying factor globally. It's our relationships and the connections that we create with others.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the final part of this segment is, based on your experience, would you combine this with any other form of practice, or that could perhaps improve upon it? I mean, you mentioned that this is the funnel method is kind of part of a 3-phase method. So what does that look like?
Yeah, so the 3-phase method is actually like what I had mentioned in terms of the one partner is actually talking. The other partner is then the second phase is the other partner is giving feedback. And then the last phase is the speaker partner is kind of giving feedback to the listening partner. Hopefully that made sense without a visualization. Yep. Certainly. I think there are many, many crucial elements to understanding relationships and understanding each other. And so I do think that building a strong foundation on friendship and understanding who people are, in particular with understanding who they are as cultural beings. And so the identities that everyone holds and the different viewpoints, and how people's different identities may shape their experiences. And certainly we know that it's not uniform, right? So in one experience, these identities may be more salient compared to another, experience. And so that's something that's important. Some of the other areas that we try to educate couples on is equity and fairness in the relationship and joint problem solving. So really trying to, not explicitly do we do this in the program yet, I think implicitly, it's really trying to challenge, as I mentioned earlier in this segment, of some of these traditional gender roles that, are, in my opinion, largely outdated. So thinking about ways in which we can divvy up roles amongst, one another in order to have equity in the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And having fun. Yeah. I mean, always have fun, try new things. I know it is so easy to get, and this is, I'm reflecting on Terry Orbach, or the love doctor, as we call her, and a very dear friend and colleague. And so she has an amazing TED talk and thinking about, how do we spice up relationships and do something different? We all know that it's so easy to say, oh, what 3 restaurants should we go to, right? Because we all have our go-tos. And then it's like, let's try something else. Let's try something different. Let's go to a new cultural festival and experience this together. And so it's really building those unique opportunities for shared memories.
Yeah. Or go on vacation and hopefully not get cut in the queue.
Yes, do that too. Yes. And then be prepared to hopefully not get cut in the queue. And if you do, oh my gosh, how great, because now you know how to cope with that stress.
Absolutely. Exactly. Well, that brings us to the end of our experiment debrief. Now I've got a couple of questions from the audience to throw at you. Are you happy to answer them?
I'm happy to answer them.
Fantastic. First question. Has texting created an added layer of relationship stress, or does it have an overall positive impact on communication with your partner?
Oh gosh, such a good question, such a loaded question. Because I will say, right, I'll give a graduate school answer. It depends on what is being texted. So I think that it's really easy, and there's a lot of amazing communication scholars that study this so much more in depth than my awareness. Yet it's thinking about maybe we're sending an emoji or we're sending some text that we think has some type of meaning, yet it likely could be received differently on the other end. And so in those instances, I think always a phone call, if possible, if available, is a really great way to communicate versus relying. I mean, certainly the advent of technology has helped globalize things for those who are afforded the opportunities to have access, yet certainly could complicate things as well.
Absolutely. And that kind of ties in really nicely to the next question is how do you deal with arguments and other stresses when you're in a long distance relationship?
Ooh,
Mm.
wow. Excellent question. Inevitably things will come up. And that's whether it be long distance, whether it be, you're sharing a household or you're living, quite close to one another. And I would say it's thinking about what is the argument really about. And I'm often reflect on John Gottman's work, who has said, what's the number one thing that couples fight about? And it's nothing. Okay. And certainly some theorists will say differently, yet it's really at the end of the day thinking about, and this is now reflective of Sue Johnson's work, yet it's thinking about, are our partners really there for us when we need them? And certainly in long distance relationships and not having, the ability to, to be physically close in proximity and touch and all the positive benefits that come from that physical affection. Yet it's really important to find a time and find a space to be able to discuss the things that are really most upsetting. And maybe some of our insecurities that may come from past relationships or even the current relationship, and kind of talking through some of that together.
And just, I guess, riffing off of that, we were talking so much about nonverbal communication, but a lot of that is lost when you're not physically with your partner and in a long distance relationship. So I feel like you almost have to make up for it even more by communicating even more and being on top of that. Am I right in that assumption? Or
Yeah, I mean, I would think so. Certainly, I do think it's really important to, let's say there's a 9+ hour difference, right? So recognizing one partner is just starting their day while the other is kind of wrapping up their day, getting ready potentially, to go out to dinner. And so it's recognizing too that maybe the initial excitement, if people were both together in the same time zone, it's very different. And I say that from personal experience of, when I've been abroad and calling my partner at 6 o'clock in the morning, our time, here in Arizona, and I'm getting ready to go out, for an aperitivo in Italy, our energy levels are certainly a little bit different. So having to be mindful of that and not necessarily taking it too personally.
yeah, absolutely. Final question is, what do you do when the main point of your stress is external and also just ongoing and unavoidable? For example, like your parents disapproving of the relationship. How do you manage that?
Oh gosh. Thank you for the loaded question. This is a very, very challenging question, and here is why. Because I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer to identify of, doing step X, Y, and Z. And this is, being mindful of cultural or societal practices that are also important. So please know that I'm reflecting on this question from a very individualistic perspective of growing up in the US. In response to that, I think it's really, again, goes back to the idea of the communication practice of what are the contexts to which family members may be disapproving of the relationship. And so I think that depending on those different factors, those can lead to different conversations. So if it's, we don't like person, A through Z because they enjoy, X hobby and that's not something that we do, that's very different than we don't approve of your relationship because of an identity that you hold, which I think is a very challenging and very hurtful, to say the least, experience. And so it's then figuring out what's best for you to navigate some of, like you yourself, to navigate some of those stressors and some of, that work thinking and relying on friends that you know are sources of support to really help you kind of navigate through some of those waters. So there's no really easy answer. Yet I would say trusting yourself, trusting others, seeking support that can really help you navigate some of those experiences, and not having it necessarily have so much of an impact on your own individual as well as your relational health.
Yeah, that's a really difficult one, especially when it's a case of identity or even culture, where that's not really something that you can easily have a conversation with your parents about and be like, hey, can you stop doing this because it's affecting my relationship? It's probably their goal, I think, at the end of the day, is if they're disapproving of it. So it's a really difficult one, not really an easy one to explain. But on that sour note, let's bring this segment to an end. And I want to move on to the open mic, where I kind of let you have a bit of a TED talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it could be related to the topic, but it doesn't have to be. And earlier we talked about you wanted to talk about the importance of publishing and elevating underrepresented voices. It's the floor is yours.
Oh, well, so very kind. Yes. Just a really quick plug, if I may. So, as an associate professor, one of the greatest, if not the greatest joys of my job is to be able to work with talented students and talented colleagues all over the world. And, recognizing powers and privileges in terms of how educational structures have been formed throughout the world, I think it's so incredibly important that we open our minds to really, what do we know? And really, what do we know about whom? And so this is a question that I've often, have with colleagues, and certainly in classes that I teach, just in terms of being mindful of when we're saying that research, or we know things about X and we know things about Y, and this is how things work. It's really taking a step beyond that to say, well, for whom and under what context? And so that's why the field is ever expanding. I'm very fortunate to be part of the International Association for Relationship Research. Shameless plug, please come to our conference, May of 2023 in Phoenix, Arizona. Thinking about ways in which we can elevate and expand our scholarship. So whether that means using diverse methodology, thinking about voices that are beyond white heterosexual college-age students between the ages of 18 and 22 years old, because we certainly know people that do not identify within those identities. And so thinking about all the unanswered questions that there are in the world, and really taking an opportunity to elevate those voices that unfortunately have been traditionally marginalized. So that is my little plug in my little soapbox, if you will.
Oh, that's amazing. So important to elevate those voices, because relationships I've learned from personal experience and also from this podcast that relationships look so different depending on where in the world you are. So thank you again for plugging that. What was the International Association for Relationship Science? Is that what it was called? Or am I...
Very close. So it is the International Association for Relationship Research. So this is actually a multidisciplinary organization that studies romantic relationships in all of its facets. We have members all over the world. We have an upcoming conference this coming May 2023. You all are welcome in beautiful Arizona. The subsequent conference after that will be in Boston. And so it's a really great organization. It combines psychologists, sociologists, communication scholars, family studies and human development scholars, or family scientists, amongst others who are really interested in really elevating and showcasing the importance of relationships in our lives.
Fantastic. And hopefully it'll be less chilly in Phoenix in May of 2023.
Absolutely. Yeah. That I can guarantee.
Fantastic. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been a pleasure. I've had such a great time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you for the very, some very easy and some very difficult questions. I appreciate it.
It's always good to have a mix of both.
Exactly.
Absolutely. You've been listening to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. For more episodes like this from 10 different life management perspectives, search LMSL on YouTube, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts, so you can get updated on everything we have to offer. We have a wide range of topics readily available for you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found at re.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Aditi Kutty. Thanks for tuning in.